everyone. We are just getting ready to start, but if you're with us at this point, please go ahead and use the chat feature to introduce yourself if you'd like, and also be ready to put your questions in there as we get started in the conversation. All right, do you think we should get started right on time?
Yeah.
So we have plenty of time for Q&A.
Definitely.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are actually in Chicago, where I wish we were all gathering in person, but we cannot be. So we are instead enjoying a sunny day and a warming trend that we all love here in Chicago. We're excited to have you join us in this presentation about expanding civic understandings and student agency through contemporary art. My name is Lynne Green, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And it's my great privilege to share the screen with my partners and Chicago Public High School art teachers, Valerie Zanos, Andrew Breen, and Miriam Dalnig. I'll start by giving you an overview of how our project came to be, what it is, and what we strive to achieve. Then you'll hear from my colleagues who will give you a snapshot view of what the program looks like at the ground level and how it continues to evolve. And if we're successful, we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. But in the meantime, please feel free to use the chat function for questions or comments as we're talking, and we'll get to those questions afterwards. If you are able and can put those chats in the Zoom chat, that would be best, but we will try and monitor both chat forms in the Pathable screens as well. Okay, let's get started. The Museum of Contemporary Art is located in downtown Chicago. We are an artist-activated and audience-engaged contemporary art museum. The MCA is an innovative and compelling center of contemporary art where the public can experience work and ideas of living artists and understand the historical, social, and cultural context of the art of our time. We seek to serve as an agent of change by sparking civic exchange and transformation. At the MCA, we approach learning by inviting visitors to contribute to and participate in contemporary artistic thinking and practice, opening up learning opportunities and new forms of engagement that consider how contemporary artists connect their work and thinking to the relevant conditions outside the museum and into their communities. In 2015, we were interested in expanding our impact outside the museum walls and into Chicago communities. We developed the SPACE program to do this. By placing a contemporary artist in a high school for a multi-year residency, the MCA committed one of its primary resources, the artist, to in-depth and sustained contact with students, teachers, and the larger student body, and ultimately community members. In collaboration, they work together to make critical comment and inform current conditions in the school and the community. The program initiative coincided with and complemented the CPS focus on reshaping civics instruction. In 2016, Illinois committed to new high school graduation requirements that included at least one semester of high school civics. We were curious if we could explore the content of civics through the lens of a contemporary art practice. So what is the SPACE program? It's a multi-year partnership with Chicago Public High Schools that empowers teens to create positive change in their communities using contemporary art strategies and expanded civic understandings. We place contemporary artists in schools to build a practice that helps to transform the school into a hub for civic exchange and dialogue. We work with civics and art teachers to design new contemporary art-based civic curriculums. Students learn about contemporary art practices and use these strategies to take action and make positive change in their communities. Our goals for space are to use the practices of contemporary artists to research and take action around local civic issues. We center young people as creative, engaged citizens and strive to develop their agency around issues that matter to them. We want to develop a model for interdisciplinary learning in civics and art. And we are interested in developing culture in classrooms and schools that present opportunities for student-driven positive change in those communities. This is the map of Chicago neighborhoods, and you'll see here our three space school partners. It was important to represent neighborhoods across Chicago, as neighborhoods are quite segregated in Chicago. And these schools represent three distinctly different neighborhoods. In space, we use a conceptual framework that includes a curricular framework. There is not a set curriculum, but rather teams use this framework to guide their curricular design and project planning. Students are introduced to the concept of civics and contemporary art as a dynamic concept, and they explore the issues that are relevant to them in their communities. They explore the bigger picture by researching these social problems and employ radical imagination to wonder how they might change or impact the problem. And they take action through art making intended to bring about positive change. This framework was originally designed as a step-by-step process, but our space teams have discovered and reported back to us that rather than progressing from one step to the next, this framework represents all of the components that make up the process, and there are multiple entry points within the framework. Here's a timeline to give you a sense of how the project evolved. We started the pilot in 2016 with research and development. And in 2017, we moved the project into Curie Metro High School. In 2018, we continued at Curie and moved into Sarah E. Good STEM Academy. In 2019, we continued at Curie and Good and moved into our third school partner, Nicholas Senn High School. Last year, we were in all three schools in the midst of a beginning pandemic, as we are now, and we have continued and are beginning conversations around sustainability. I wanted to wrap up my portion by just sharing with you this quote from one of our student partners who says, "There are people I never see interact with an assignment. When the artist comes in and poses a question or gives us an assignment, they get into it. They learn in a different way. The artist gets us thinking. We put our pencils down and really use our brains." And this was a Good student working with our resident artist at Good, Damon Locks. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm not progressing. There we go. I'm going to hand the screen over to one of my colleagues, Valerie Zanos at Curie Metro High School. And as I said, you're going to start seeing what this program looks like at each of our three school sites, which will be very different. And each site represents a different phase of building in our program. And since we began at Curie High School, we're going to begin with Valerie Zanos. So Val, it's all yours.
Hello, my name is Valerie Zanos. I've been teaching at Curie Metropolitan High School for 21 years. This is not only where I work, but where I grew up, raised my family, and I still live. It means a lot for me to work within my own community. I choose to teach here because I want to be an active participant of change in a place where I know it's needed. As a community member, mother, teacher, artist, and activist, I feel called to a duty to make a difference. In 2016, I was invited by the MCA to partner my art course, the Guerrilla Art Collective, as the pilot for space. And I was honored to be partnered with Andres Hernandez, our resident artist, to develop the framework for space. This was a momentous and serendipitous partnership, as Andres and I have similar methodologies in our teaching practices that are very different from the traditional studio art course. Our approach starts from a very specific point. That is teaching not just as teachers, but through the lens of our own art practices. If we could run a class as artists, for artists, what could that look like? We created a classroom space that opens the door for students to experience their own collective practice. We view ourselves as facilitators of the artistic process, those who have experience and skills that can be passed on to students in order to give them their own agency in the curriculum. We developed a framework that was focused on key civics and contemporary art themes, but was also loose enough for people to interpret and activate in a variety of ways. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, go back. You were on the right one. I apologize. Thanks. The Guerrilla Art Collective uses the classroom to create a space where student artists act as agents of social justice. Students use contemporary and interdisciplinary art methods to approach their creations to be part of a larger social practice and make change within their own community. Furthermore, the students have agency in the development of projects and curriculum. Every year is fresh and different because our curriculum is responsive to the needs and focus of those particular students. They act as artists who are part of a true collective and work collaboratively with Andres and I to develop our aesthetic strategies and create a community engaged product that reaches beyond school walls. If we could break down the hierarchy as much as is allowed by Chicago public school structure, what could that look like? How do we teach them the artistic process as a source of agency? And this is where our own art practices come into play. We explore methods of creation in order to offer options of process to the student. Andres' practice in particular serves as our starting point of inspiration. His studio at Curie High School is a place for his own work, but also for the students to create, curate, and facilitate art actions for the Curie community. GAC members have even served as interns in my studio residency at the Chicago Art Department. And in that picture, that's just outside Andres' studio at our school. Next slide. Through the years, we've encountered many challenges. Curie has had the misfortune of losing our civics partner teacher 3 different times due to unlucky circumstances. We had the same issue with retaining our resident artist. Andres had to leave after the first year. He was offered the opportunity to represent America at the 2018 Venice Architectural Biennale, and who could pass that up? So we switched resident artists, but we did end up getting 3 different resident artists over the next 2 years. So you can imagine my joy at Andres returning to space in 2019. I myself have encountered personal illnesses that took me out of the classroom at times. And we've also experienced internal problems at Curie. We once had a large art department with students who majored in art, taking multiple classes over their 4 years of high school. We functioned like a small arts college. However, our once rich art majors program changed over recent years into an offering of elective classes. This resulted in a drain of skilled and interested students. Programming became a challenge. The GAC is such a specialized course, it requires a certain type of student who's not only interested in working with issues of social justice, but also relishes the responsibility that comes from student agency and collective control. Not all students want that in their art course. Curie is currently working to rebuild our majors program, and I now have an introductory class that feeds into the GAC, and that's making a difference. And finally, like everyone here, the pandemic and racist civil unrest in this country has taken its toll on our students and classrooms. However, we have persevered. We've learned from our struggles and continue to make the space program richer and more responsive to student needs. Next slide. I'd like to share the work from our first year and contrast it with this year. During the 2016-17 school year, Andres and I worked with the GAC to develop a project that was foremost responsive to their pressing issues. Sanctuary was created to address the increasing street violence in our community, anti-immigrant aggression, the lack of cultural space in our neighborhoods, and finally, the emergence of the now infamous Laquan McDonald video that showed a 17-year-old boy being gunned down by a policeman just a few blocks from Curie. The students wanted to create a space for our community to engage with these issues and contribute to a world that encouraged safety and access for all. This resulted in a festival of installation art, performances, workshops, and dialogue. In Lost Miami Bowl, students considered the loss of a former neighborhood gathering space, now a vacant lot, as well as its future potential. Safety Nest invited people to add to a sculptural installation by sharing their definitions of community safety. Next slide. Home Tweet Home was a workshop where students invited people to construct their own sculptures of sanctuary. People were interviewed about their ideas of safety and access as a celebration of free public speech in Sanctuary Soapbox. And finally, participants experienced the sudden joy of a poetry flash mob. Students wore t-shirts with letters and spelled out different words related to concepts of safety and equal access. This was an ambitious project, and I admit there were days when Andres and I wondered if we bit off more than we could chew. But our commitment to creating as a collective meant that we had to trust our students to pull it off, and they did. This festival was a labor of love, a gift to the community. Some students from that year are still involved with the JC on various levels. Next slide. This year, we chose to respond to the intense emotional and social needs that arose from the trauma of the COVID pandemic and the civil unrest after the George Floyd murder. The Black Lives Matter movement is inspiring to our students who are largely marginalized by society as BIPOC. Our students have been suffering from depression, anxiety, and economic, physical, and emotional precarity. The COVID disease has struck our neighborhood particularly hard. We've had a lot of losses in our community. So we began the year with looking at self-care through the lens of social activism. In particular, considering Audre Lorde's concept of self-care being a radical act of resistance to oppression. We questioned and researched how artists can turn self-care acts into works of art. Students explored how performances of self-care can lead to empowerment. They created self-care vision boards, musical playlists accompanied by drawings, and earthworks installations. Next slide. Inspired by Andres's practice of creating performative movement scores, the JAC created videos, photographs, drawings, and collages in response to his score, Take a Line for a Long Walk. It was interesting to see how student artists could interpret these instructions and develop a documented performance. The JAC then wrote their own performance scores around self-care, play, and mindfulness. Next slide. They performed each other's scores as ways to embody a daily practice of self-care. They documented their performances with video, photographs, drawings, and collages. The written scores have resulted in the Infinite Care Book, which will be gifted to the community. The hopes being that as people read and perform these scores, they too can benefit from an empowered self-care practice. So here you see one of the Infinite Care Book scores written by Victoria. Stand up straight with legs straight and arms making an O in front of you. Step forward with your right leg and twirl and spin with a little jump. And then here we have a performance by Jasmine. I really love that little bit at the end where she's smiling. Despite some of the self-consciousness of trying to record yourself doing someone else's performance, you really see that the light that comes into her face at the end, which is exactly what we're looking for in these types of performances. Next slide. So there were many of these pieces made, of course, in addition to all the other works. And the JAC needed to find a safe way to present this gift of the care book, as well as their performances and artwork, despite the pandemic and the fact that we have been remote learning for almost a year. We solved this by curating an ambitious virtual reality exhibition. In this exhibition, the JAC presented their self-care journey through various artworks, performances, and writing. Enlightening quotes and prompts urged the viewer to consider concepts of self-care, community care, and empowerment. They offered up a sampling of the Infinite Care Book scores so that viewers can participate in at-home performances while feeling inspired by the student works they view. The JAC is about to embark upon a social media campaign to share this virtual exhibition, hoping that this gift of self-care can spread empowerment throughout the world as an act of resistance. Survival is a radical act, and self-care gives the opportunity to emerge from these traumas stronger and wiser to create a better world. Next slide. So you can follow us on our Instagram, which of course, much of this work will be shared in days to come. And you can see the IG address there. But we are also giving you a special sneak peek into our exhibit. Just as we're tweaking the finer details, you can experience self-care is self-love at this link. That's the name of our exhibition. Please pardon our dust as we may be making some final adjustments. We hope that you enjoy our work and find solace in performing the infinite care book scores. Join us in our resistance and let us rise together. And the link is there, but I will also add it to the chat in a moment. So thanks for your attention. Please welcome Andrew Breen as he shares his own space experiences from Good STEM Academy.
Hello, everyone. If you could go to the next slide. Right. Hello, I'm Andrew Breen. I'm an art teacher. I was an art teacher at Good STEM Academy. My pronouns are he, his. Today, I'm going to focus on the co-teaching curriculum at Good. If you would like to see more of the breakdown of our process and our projects, you can find attachments in our session tab. Located on the southwest side of Chicago, Good was the second partnered space school consisting of myself, Maria Scandariato, she was a civics teacher, Damon Lux, our resident artist. Good is a relatively new school with a lot of ambitious teachers and innovative students. So we were excited to further build our school culture around civically engaged art. And next slide. So when the partnership started, the idea of co-teaching really wasn't even on our radar. Using the space curriculum framework Lynne mentioned earlier, the two of us taught and developed curriculums separately in our respective disciplines of civics and AP art. Because we had different rooms and schedules, Damon would switch off between classes and share his range of practices with our students. So his socially engaged music, his album art, his printmaking. And as we built relationships and cultivated student voices, students created 2 end of the semester shows of digital mixed media protest posters and sound collages. Because the space curriculum framework was deliberately open-ended, our first year was more about testing things out, figuring out our rhythm between the 3 of us and our students, and how all of this influenced student and community impact. While Damon and I collaborated to develop student-led projects, there were many moments in my teaching where I would consult with Maria on the civics end. We realized students could make deeper connections with contemporary art practices and civics if we taught together. This idea of this co-teaching model was never the original intention of SPACE or our school's administration, but our proposal was eagerly welcomed by everyone because there was a willingness and a trust to experiment with creating a new course where students would earn both a civics and an art credit. In the second year as co-teachers, Maria, Damon, and I were able to play to each other's strengths. All of our students had never taken an art or civics class in high school, so students utilized several resources to develop an understanding of the principles of democracy and the principles of contemporary art. We would often model conversations in class by adding to each other's ideas and encouraging students to make connections between research, civic issues, and how artists can raise awareness and make an impact in their communities. But what we didn't realize until our second year was to break down some of those misconceptions of what art is or could be. It doesn't have to be something that's pretty on a white wall or be this fixed experience between viewers and a single artist. This eventually led to students co-creating futuristic radio plays where they were asked to radically imagine an alternative world or future and creating narratives and soundscape environments. Just like the first year, this was an evolution for our students and for us as co-teachers. We were not familiar with radio play genres and embraced this vulnerability to try something new that responded to civic issues. And next slide. So in year 3, we continued to adjust and respond with a new group of space students. Using the curriculum framework instead of sequentially allowed us to thread and carry recurring ideas of power, participation, and dialogue. So here's a timeline of what led to the 10 Days of Change, the school-wide event. This consisted of developing manifestos and posters, recording soapbox speeches and art activities led by the space students. And the next slide. So this began with a month-long, so this was back in September, back in 2019. So this began with a month-long dialogue, figuring out what students cared about as a collective. In true democratic fashion, each class discussed, revised, and arrived at a consensus of their intentions and beliefs about the world they live in. To spread awareness and discussion, these manifesto statements eventually led to group posters, buttons, t-shirt designs, which they could then use to start conversation with others at school. And so this is one of the manifesto statements the students came up with. This was a very laborious process. It took a long time to come to an agreement. Next slide. Informed by this manifesto and curriculum framework, students began identifying specific issues they cared about in their community and developed soapbox speeches grounded in research. These were recorded and played over the school's intercom and were also performed during the 10 Days of Change in December. Students embraced getting out of that normal classroom setting where they were able to lead the discussions and art activities. But this was not without, of course, its challenges. On the third day of 10 Days of Change, students would always debrief. So they debriefed about how they could improve their facilitation skills and how to frame these activities to those who visited. A problem they noticed was visitors were unclear of the purpose and their role in these socially engaged activities. This debrief was particularly memorable and a teachable moment because it forced students to reflect and think and rethink their purpose and how to effectively engage with others on enacting positive community change. Okay, and so these were some of the topics around their soapbox speeches that they chose. And next slide. So 10 Days of Change was obviously before the pandemic, but that didn't stop students from still having dialogue with other artists. Artist Care Packages was born out of our pre-pandemic Artists of the Week routines and focusing on student mental health. Since we were remote, Damon asked his artist community about their practice that helped them during the pandemic and what they were doing for self-care. Students would watch the Artist Care Package videos and generate follow-up questions and insights to be shared back to the artist. So it was this continual dialogue that we were doing last year, and it was so powerful. Let's see, go next slide. So there were many, many lessons learned, not just learning from our students, but also just the co-teaching model itself. We learned that there needed to be a willingness to experiment and understand the process is hard and it takes time to develop. Not only us creating the curriculum, but also with the students that there's a process to this. It's not just the final result. Another thing we learned was that stakeholders must hold each other accountable to ensure student success. So Lynne played a really pivotal role in that, and the MCA, to make sure that if we need any resources. Another part was stakeholders must hold each other accountable to ensure that their student success. And then, I said that one already. And then building trust with admin was huge. And just to show that, because we weren't really sure, would they be willing to do this, this co-teaching model. And all of this, of course, goes back to the student-led art and their success in that. And then lastly, we came across this each year was, distinguishing traditional art versus contemporary art. So we found that if we frequently reflected on just socially engaged art examples, that really helped emphasize the power and the purpose of this collective space program. So thank you. Now we're going to turn it over to Miriam.
Thanks. So I'm Miriam Dalnig. I'm a visual art teacher at Sen High School. We are in our third year of our partnership with the space program currently. Next slide, please. So after a year of the program being at SEN, we started asking ourselves, how can we go bigger and deeper with these ideas? The space framework is focused on affecting big and small student-driven changes in our community. So we began thinking about what this could look like in a larger way at SEN. At this point, our work was mostly living inside our classrooms and just beginning to creep outward. We began asking ourselves, what can we do now to bring this work outside of our own classrooms and intentionally spread it throughout our school and greater community? We began realizing in order to do this, in order to grow and go deeper with space at our school, we needed to invest in this goal specifically. There was not enough time to work around these goals while also creating curriculum. Because of this, we ended up proposing a team to work around strategizing how space can make a bigger impact on the culture of our school to our principal. In starting this process, we began asking ourselves the following questions. How can students' work in the program inspire our colleagues? How can a collaboration between art and civics influence other disciplines? In what other ways and spaces can we take students' lead in creating change in our community? How can the space framework inspire all of us to reimagine what kind of change is possible in a school environment that often feels fixed and regulated? How can collaborative reimagining be a central goal or even just incorporated into the curriculum for other disciplines? In addition, how do we use the resources that we've been given by the MCA after the partnership is over? How can the space framework continue to influence our community after the MCA is gone? And we developed a vision and mission to help us guide our work around these questions. Next slide, please. These are big goals and goals that take investment and time. We're not expecting any of this to happen immediately, but we were excited to spend intentional time planning for when the partnership ends and to grow the program in the meantime. How does this happen? One of our first goals was to more intentionally communicate with our colleagues about the work we were doing with space. Last fall, we brought our entire staff to the MCA to look at contemporary art, work with the MCA artist guides in the same way that our students do, and start to make connections between contemporary art, civic engagement, and their own teaching. This was also an opportunity for our resident artist to talk with the staff directly and share the work that he had been making during the residency. We believe strongly that sharing the work happening in our classrooms and collaboration with space was the most important way to invite others to join us. The work is magical, cross-disciplinary, unique. It doesn't cleanly fit into unit plans, and schools are set up in a way where this work doesn't just naturally happen on its own. Regularly sharing what happens in space classes with the larger school community, along with the tools guiding us, was where we thought we would begin. What happens when the full school community sees the investment of students when they are given the opportunity to take a collaborative role in the classroom and invited to use the space of school to create the change that they would like to see? Next slide, please. This conversation led us to thinking intentionally about what else feeds this kind of work and how can we put structures in place for it to continue after we are no longer working directly with the MCA. For us, the number one answer to both of these questions is time. So often this work only happens because teachers spend time outside of school, the school day, planning for it. This kind of work requires a different pace of planning. There needs to be time and space to step back and reimagine what's possible. These are not regular lesson plans that teachers create. The goal is for it to be a collaborative process between teachers, students, and artists. It takes a lot of time to create an environment where student-driven action can happen, and schools have to be willing to prioritize time for that planning to take place. Common planning time, day-long retreats, paid after-school planning, or it will go to the wayside when teachers get busy. We're also continuing to advocate for a co-taught space class as another way to encourage collaboration that would not be able to happen otherwise. What happens when teachers and students regularly come together to see civics and art making as one goal, as opposed to trying to find time for one to influence the other outside of class? We hope that this could potentially continue even after the NCA is actively in partnership with our school. Next slide. We've also begun to imagine how we might continue to use the Space Studio after the NCA funds a resident artist. We are left with a room in our school that has intentionally been transformed into an artist space and a space for collaborating around these ideas. What could happen if we continued to use it that way after the NCA is gone? How might we use it as leverage to continue bringing in artists for residencies in exchange for working with our students? Could this also grow as a community space in the school for potential cross-curricular collaboration? This is a model that we use with other arts disciplines in our school, specifically with theater and dance. But before our partnership with the museum, we never had a space that we could offer as a studio or residency space in exchange for collaboration or programming with our students. We now hope to eventually use the studio as a connection point to artists in our community. The studio could also be used as a space for public programming for the school, artist talks, workshops, etc. for students and teachers. When we are no longer in active partnership with the NCA, we'll be left with a dedicated artist studio space in the school, and ideally a community that values and has experienced the magic of creating work in this way. We hope that these resources and values will continue to feed and grow the work in our school community. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam. And I will bring up the rear by just quickly talking about where we are and some of the lessons we've learned so that we can allow a little time for question and answers. We've learned a lot. This is the end of a 5-year pilot program. And I don't think we had any idea all that we would be learning at the start of this, but we have learned a great deal in collaboration with each other. Some of our lessons learned, some of my teacher partners here have mentioned, and I'll just elaborate. It's really important that there is a long-term investment made clear to everyone. The fact that we have an artist who can stay in a school space, not only through the entire school year, but on multiple years, allows for building of trust, an understanding of the community, and opportunities for real, deep, authentic partnership. It's also important that there is a shared vision on the part of everyone, the administration, teachers, artists, students. Students ideally are helping to set this vision also through the course of this course. It's really important to find the right artist. Valerie mentioned some of the struggles we've had in retaining a good artist fit for her school community. That is a challenge. It's important to find an artist who understands the values and the goals of this project, who feels comfortable in that setting, whose work aligns with the nature of this project. And that was definitely a learning curve for us at the MCA, is to understand that and identify how to articulate the role of the artist in this project. It's really important, as you can probably imagine, to think about consciously building and maintaining the community that's set up. These are learning communities. These are extended learning communities, and they don't just happen. There is trust required. There is a lot of maintenance and support necessary to make sure that everyone is on the same page, make sure that everyone is trusting each other, and that there is a culture built where students can lead. You need to, and Miriam, I think all three teachers spoke to this, and Miriam certainly at the end, about the need for shared planning time. This is tough. As Miriam said, the schools are not set up for teachers to collaborate. They are set up individually and often isolated, certainly from other departments and sometimes even within their own departments. So the notion of collaboratively building curriculum is something that there isn't a system in place, generally speaking, at the schools. So helping to build that system and helping administrators to work together to find solutions to that challenge has been hard. We're getting there, but that's definitely been a lesson learned for us. And then I think the last important lesson learned is to make the work visible. One of the teachers mentioned that this work stays within the classroom a lot, and that's important in terms of building the community within that classroom space. But until it gets out of the walls of that classroom and even out into the community where that school resides, students aren't able to have the impact that they could potentially have if this work were more visible. It's also important in terms of changing the school culture. If students and faculty and administrators see how this work looks, how it works, that's how these changes happen. And it's also how students feel like they are able to make an impact when they are able to take the work out into their community. So what's next? As I mentioned, we are at the end of a 5-year funding. This was a pilot. Thank goodness we were given 5 years for this pilot, because it's taken us that long to arrive at what we feel is success. And now we're trying to figure out where we go from here. In the meantime, we had a pandemic that threw a huge wrench into everything. And so we are currently in the mode of working with each school site to devise a sustainability plan. The MCA will not stay in this capacity forever. And it's important that we work with each school to design a sustainability plan that is unique to their vision and what they want to accomplish with this project in their school. And of course, we have to work with the administration to do that. One important lesson for the MCA is that the MCA has decided to make this a core program. That's big, because this was a huge project for the MCA Learning Department to take on. And again, most of our work up to this point had been pretty much contained within the walls of the museum, and it's messy when you get out into the community. So the fact that the MCA has decided to make this a core program is going to help us fulfill our strategic plan goals, and we're excited to see where this goes next. And in order to do that, we are seeking additional funding to expand our work by wrapping up the work in these 3 sites and thinking about what it looks like moving into new and additional school partners. We hope to maintain our relationships with these really important space schools, but that will look different. And hopefully we can continue building out a larger community of schools participating in this project. So I'm going to stop the share, and thank you all for listening to us. And I'm actually going to invite my colleagues who have been watching the chat probably better than I, to open it up if there are any questions that we want to begin with in the chat, and then open it up to any additional questions people might have. Miriam, Andrew, Valerie, did you see any questions you wanted to start with?
Yeah, I see one from Melissa Friedwald. I hope I said your name correctly. If the MCA funds the resident artists, and I responded, yes, they're funded for their time in their classrooms and in their studio. But she also asked if there are state standards that have to be considered with a combination of civics and art courses. And just as for my part, I can answer part of that with the state standards, and then I'll pass it on to the rest of you. We actually, in my course, we follow the national art standards. We feel it fits best with the type of process that we use in my classroom. So I follow the national standards.
Yeah, I actually do the same. Yeah, I typically follow more of the national. And then since we were a combination, since we were co-teaching, yeah, the social science civic standards we used, and some ELA literacy standards as well. And I can put that in the chat. I have a Google Doc of the ones we used.
And I will just say, for the benefit of the civics teachers who are not represented here, this is the value of doing a co-teaching model and a partnership model. Each of our art teachers are accountable to the standards that they would normally be accountable to in their teaching, and the civics teachers are as well. And of course, that comes into conflict sometimes when you're designing shared curriculum around shared values. But each teacher, this is why the program is so magical, each teacher is responsible for those standards by their administration. So they are the ones coming back to us, telling us if things are not getting met or hit in the way that they need to, then we have to backtrack and figure out what we need to change or beef up in the curriculum. But I can also say at Sen School right now, the teachers there have been exploring a co-teaching model as well. And one of the things that is happening is the civics teacher is saying that it's changing the way that she approaches civics instruction. So while she's still meeting all of her standards and accountability measures, she also is completely revising the way she thinks about hitting those standards, which is of course what we hope happens across the board.
And then there is a question in the Zoom chat. I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I was just going to ask for more questions.
This is from, it's more of a statement that I think requires a response. It's from Christy Watson, who says, "This sounds amazing. I think your next step would be to help create a document that helps other districts design an art and civics engagement curriculum," which we recently started talking about. Some of the, throw that back to you, Lynn.
Yeah, that's exactly where we would like to be. When this project started, the goal was to create replicable models that would happen throughout Chicago and ideally on a national or international stage. I can say that is still something we're interested in, but that's not where the resources have gone up to this point. And that's really, I keep referring to all of our school site partners and administrators as we need to think about phase 2 of this project. And phase 2 will force us to think about how to capture the learning and create the structures, because we'll be starting in new schools. There's so much that we've learned in this year, in these 5 years, that our next step will definitely be to figure out, how do you replicate this model? How do you help other schools, other districts understand the priorities and values that we represent and how to build those? So that definitely is where we are interested in going next. Nina says, Val, you're muted, by the way.
Sorry, thank you. Oh, can you read Nina's?
Yeah, as a museum professional, I feel I encounter many barriers to getting this level of community involvement drafted into our strategic plans. Do you have any tips for navigating and prioritizing this conversation with higher ups? Great question. I'm sure that this is a conversation that is equally challenging at the school level as well. But I will speak myself for the museum. It has been challenging. It was initially started this project through a question by a generous funder. What would you do if you had X amount of dollars that would help you further your goals? And again, the museum has stated a value in becoming an agent of civic change. But we've been trying to do that within our museum programming. And it was important for us to go out into the community to try to do a project like this. And we were lucky to have the funding that allowed us to explore and experiment. That's not to say that everyone at the museum knew what we were doing, understood what we were doing, or even saw the value for what we were doing. And quite honestly, I think that is something that we learned in these last few years, is why it's important to demonstrate the value that a project like this represents for the museum. that's something that I've been working on over the last year or two, and trying to help the museum recognize the pathways and the access points that we are enabling by functioning in community settings. I've been pitching this work as a satellite project for the museum in communities that would never enter that museum otherwise. And so that's the pitch that I have been making. And as I said in my presentation, I am thrilled that the MCA has decided to, outside of this 5-year pilot funding, make this a core program because of the value that they see. And it's a long haul. In a year of pandemic, when the museum has been closed for a majority of the year, that was not an easy sell, but I'm excited to say that it is. And Nina, if you want any more specifics, I'd be glad to talk to you offline about that.
Can you see Nina's question there?
Was it
She's asking about if you had to write any grants.
to continue? We are in that process right now. It was primarily supported through this one generous funder.
And in the future, since Curie is going to be one of the first schools to be coming off of the program, and the idea of sustaining it, which is the big question, how do we sustain it? And there's very complex answers to that. But to start with would be our own funding. So how do we fund ourselves? How does the school commit to funding us? Can the school commit to funding us, or part of it or all of it? And that is going to include, we're assuming, writing grants to continue that funding and continue to build and then keep the structure. Because the last thing we want to do is have the MCA, when they leave, have this all fall apart after everything we've built. We want to keep it going. So that is going to be part of our conversation, is both the structure and the funding.
Yeah,
And
and
you
for
go
good, and for good even, just the, you know, reaching out to other teachers in the community and figuring out like who would be game to do these things, because obviously some teachers, you know, have their own thing, but you know, Maria was just really open to trying, you know, to build this curriculum from scratch. So that was another, I think, key element.
And I would say, if Miriam, you feel comfortable talking about this, this is why we are not just saying, whoops, okay, we're done now, goodbye. We have continued to invest some money even into next year to help each of these 3 sites think about and work towards a structure that will be sustainable. And those conversations are difficult. Honestly, it's the first time I am putting in the room together the teachers and the artists and the principals to have these conversations, because there's some education and some learning on everyone's part to imagine what this might look like. And Miriam is playing that role right now at her school, at Sen High School, in envisioning with the principal, with other faculty members at the school, what we can build towards that sustainable model. I think we have a minute or 2 left. Thanks, Andrew. Did you want to say anything, Miriam?
I was just going to add that we already use like our theater space and our dance studio space and our school to bring in dance companies and local theater companies in our community to work with students. And so we're really excited to start thinking about creative ways to continue to bring in space artists or artists in general in our community using the resources that the MCA has already given us. So yes, we're just beginning those conversations now at Sen.
All right, it looks like we are at time, and we are going to get kicked out. So I will do a formal wrap to say thank you all for being here. Andrew, thank you for putting our contact information in the chat. These are quick sessions, so if you have questions that we haven't answered, please feel free to reach out to us. We love this project and are excited to share it as much as possible. So thank you all for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.